In the late 90s, a French naturalist named Patrice Fay was documenting crocodile attacks in Burundi. He was interviewing a fisherman about a crocodile that killed his brother. Nothing surprising for Fay. Crocodile attacks are common in East Africa, but he wrote it down as documenting them is part of the job. Except, the fisherman added a particularly odd detail. The crocodile didn't eat the body. That didn't make sense, so at first the naturalist assumed the man was exaggerating. Then he interviewed another witness, then another, and another, all telling the same story. Fay doesn't know it yet, but he just stumbled upon to what will become the most disturbing wildlife cases ever documented. After hearing these stories, the naturalist started investigating because what he was hearing didn't make biological sense. Crocodiles are cold-blooded, which means every movement costs them energy they can't afford to waste. When a crocodile attacks, it's a big investment in terms of energy. Leaving a kill uneaten is like paying for a meal and walking out of the restaurant without eating it. Something is wrong here, and yet the witnesses kept describing exactly that and were all unanimous about it. By the way, we are in 1998, in Burundi along the Ruzizi River. More precisely, in the delta where the river meets Lake Tanganyika. During his investigation, Fay found that the attacks weren't isolated at all. They stretched back to the late 80s, scattered across different villages along the Ruzizi River and the northern shore of Lake Tanganyika. Different places in time, but the same strange signature. Victims killed by a crocodile and then abandoned, left to rot in the sun. In the village, a fisherman showed Fay his huge stomach scars. He was nearly gutted by this crocodile, but is somehow still alive. His story was terrifyingly common. Fay was called to the shores of Lake Tanganyika after reports of another attack. The lifeless body was mostly intact. No witnesses or proof it was the crocodile, but the signature was there in front of his very eyes. Local fishermen had already connected the dots long before Fay arrived. They had a name for the animal: the Demon of the Ruzizi. A crocodile so massive, it had become something closer to legend than wildlife, spotted occasionally over the decades but never captured or killed despite numerous attempts. The stories Fay collected described a massive crocodile far bigger than anything they've seen that wore the evidence of failed hunts across its body. Kalashnikov bullet scars lined up along the hide and a deep gouge in the left shoulder blade, probably left by a spear. But what truly troubled Fay was the body count. When he started tallying the attacks attributed to this specific animal, not crocodiles in general, but this one in particular, the number climbed past 20 and kept going. 60 confirmed deaths, and up to 300 if you counted the unexplained disappearances along the river stretching back to the 1980s. For perspective, 60 verified kills already exceed the known body count of 99.9% human serial killers. Villages along the Ruzizi River had been losing people for nearly 2 decades from the same crocodile, and despite trying, nobody could stop it so far. Some villagers claimed the crocodile was 40 feet long. Others said it was red or yellow or had tufts of grass growing from its skull like some kind of swamp demon. Fay needed to see for himself whether any of this was real. He had testimonies, but testimonies don't prove anything. So Fay went looking for proof, and what better proof than seeing the beast himself? The problem is, Ruzizi River stretches across miles of muddy water, reed beds, and sandbanks that shift with the seasons. A crocodile can stay submerged for a long time, surfacing only to breathe before disappearing again. Finding one specific animal in that maze, even supposedly the size of a truck, was like searching for a particular needle in a warehouse full of needles. Everyone talks about this crocodile, but rare are those who have seen it. Weeks passed, and despite Fay patrolling by boat and talking to anyone who claimed a recent sighting, he found nothing. Each time he arrived somewhere the crocodile had supposedly been spotted, the animal was already gone. After 2 years of investigation, He began to wonder whether the whole story wasn't just a legend that had grown out of control. Until that afternoon in the late 90s. He spotted something on a sandbank. At first glance, it looked like a fallen tree trunk or a pile of debris washed up by the current. But after taking a closer look, without the shadow of a doubt, it was a crocodile. His head was the size of an oil drum. Running along the back were 3 healed bullet wounds, exactly where the witnesses said they would be. The deep gouge in the left shoulder blade was there too. He finally found it. According to him, the animal measured between 18 and 21 feet and weighed over 2,000 pounds. These numbers are staggering when you consider that Nile crocodiles rarely exceed 16 feet for a weight of around 1,100 pounds. 2 years of doubt evaporated in about 3 seconds. Everything the fisherman had described was real, and if anything, they had become conservative. Faye moved closer to get a better look at the teeth, which would have helped him estimate the animal's age. He approached from the front, slowly, through the tall grass. Before Faye could react, the crocodile noticed them and dove into the water with a massive splash and was gone. He never got to see the teeth that day, but had seen enough to know the animal was real and the largest Nile crocodile ever documented. To him, destroying something like this before science had a chance to study it would be a massive waste. The name he chose for this crocodile was Gustav. And he decided that if Gustav was going to be stopped, he would have to be captured alive to be studied. In 2002, Faye brought his case to the Minister of the Environment in Burundi, explaining that this animal was exceptional and worthy of study, and that it shouldn't be killed but taken in alive. The minister agreed, but with a condition. Burundi was still recovering from a decade of civil war that had killed 300,000 people. The current peace was fragile, so Patrice was granted 60 days to act, after which a change of government risks plunging the entire country into civil war again. A fierce race against the clock started. 60 days isn't much time, especially when your target doesn't behave the way it's supposed to. So Faye and his team designed a cage, 30 feet long, over a ton of steel, built specifically to hold an animal of Gustav's size. He brought in specialists, a South African scientist who had successfully captured over 400 crocodiles, and a Tunisian expert who ran a farm with hundreds of Nile crocodiles. Nobody on the team had ever dealt with anything like Gustav. While the cage was being built, the team studied Gustav's behavior, and what they found didn't fit any model, to say the least. Crocodiles are territorial animals, which means they usually claim a stretch of water and defend it for years. This should make them relatively easy to find once you know their territory. Except Gustav didn't follow that rule. He would strike a village, sometimes killing multiple people within days, then vanish for months. When he resurfaced, it would be miles away in a completely different section of the river and then nothing again for months. He was still killing without eating, and nobody could explain why. 2 months before the team arrived, a park ranger had witnessed something that shouldn't be possible. Gustav killing and eating a fully grown hippopotamus. Not a baby, an adult hippo. If you watched this video, you already know that crocodiles stand no chance against adult hippos. Attacking hippos is exceptionally rare, and when it happens, it's usually the end of their lives. This crocodile had somehow learned to operate outside the rules that 200 million years of evolution had written for his species. Crocodiles don't move strategically to avoid retaliation. Gustav did. Crocodiles don't kill and leave the meat to rot when their entire metabolism is designed around conserving energy. Gustav did. Crocodiles don't attack 4,000-pound hippos that can easily crush their bones. Gustav did, and he won. Everything about this animal suggests that something had fundamentally changed in the way he functioned. The question is, what? Something had made him this way. Gustav is unlike anything we've seen in recorded animal history. A giant crocodile that kills humans and leaves the bodies uneaten. If we want to understand how he became this way, we need to look at every element that shaped him. And like any good investigation, we start with the crime scene. This is the Great Lakes region of Central Africa. This river, connecting Lake Kivu in the north, one of the Great Lakes of East Africa, to Lake Tanganyika in the south, is called the Ruzizi, as we've seen. It forms a natural border. On one side, Rwanda. On the other side, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And right here at the southern end, Burundi. This is where Gustav was born, in the lower section near the Rusizi National Park. As the current slows, the water spreads into marshlands and shallow banks. This is the kind of environment where crocodiles can grow old and large without much competition, hunting prey that comes to the water's edge to drink. But this location has another property that becomes central to our investigation. The Ruzizi works like a funnel. Anything entering the water upstream, whether from Rwanda or Congo, eventually flows through this stretch of the river. Whatever happens hundreds of miles north eventually comes down here. Speaking of which, this region has a history that makes that property highly relevant to our case. Based on Gustav's size alone, any expert would have estimated he was close to 100 years old. But how old was he really? Size alone can't answer that. Teeth, however, they can, which is why Faye was so obsessed with seeing Gustav's teeth. When he finally got close enough to see inside Gustav's jaws, the teeth were almost perfect. Crocodiles lose and replace their teeth throughout their lives, and older ones tend to have worn, incomplete sets, which wasn't the case for Gustav. Thanks to the teeth, we know Gustav was born in the 1940s, which means he was at most around 60 years old. For the first 2 or 3 decades of his life until the 70s, nothing unusual happened in the region. But then came 1972. To understand what happened, it's important to know that Burundi has 2 main ethnic groups: the Hutus, who make up the majority of the population, and the Tutsis, who historically held political and military power. In 1972, a Hutu uprising in the south triggered a massive retaliation from the Tutsi-led government. The army began systematically eliminating anyone educated enough to organize future resistance. In a few months, between 100,000 and 200,000 people were killed. Many of the bodies ended up in the rivers, and when you're killing at that scale for logistical reasons and to hide the evidence, rivers become the easiest solution. The Ruzizi's current being high, it carried many of them south, right through Gustav's territory. This is where Faye's theory comes in. According to him, this sudden abundance of free meat enabled Gustav to reach his exceptional size. More specifically, those years of feeding on human remains without having to hunt could have broken something in his brain and disconnected the instinct to kill from the need to eat. But there's a problem with this theory. Unlike mammals, crocodiles never really stop growing, but the pace slows down drastically with age. In the first 10 years, a Nile crocodile goes from 1 foot to about 8 feet. Between 10 and 20, they add maybe 50% more, reaching 11 or 12 feet. Between 20 and 30, growth slows to 15 or 20%. After that, we're talking inches per decade. At that age, late 20s or early 30s, a Nile crocodile is already fully mature. The explosive growth phases are over. Under normal circumstances, a crocodile's growth curve flattens around this time. The bodies may have fed Gustav, but they arrived too late to explain his giganticism. Thousands of crocodiles lived in the Ruzizi during those years. All had access to the same bodies, and yet none of them became like Gustav. Unless Gustav was never a normal crocodile to begin with. The growth rates I mentioned earlier are averages. They describe what happens to most crocodiles, most of the time, but averages hide the extreme cases. In any population, a few individuals grow much faster or much larger than the rest. We don't always know why. Sometimes it's genetics or something in their early environment. These cases are rare, but they happen. When you have millions of Nile crocodiles living across Africa, rare stops being theoretical. Somewhere, at some point, an unusually large and fast-growing individual will be born. It's a statistical certainty. Most of these outliers live and die in rivers where nothing special happens. They grow big, they dominate their territory, and nobody outside the local fishermen ever hears about them. But this particular outlier was born at the southern end of a funnel that would channel decades of human violence directly through his territory. Speaking of violence, in 1988, the massacres of Antegha and Marangara killed several thousand people. The political context was different from 1972, but for the rivers, the result was the same. Bodies flowed downstream through the same funnel, passing through the same marshlands, although in smaller numbers than in 1972. This is when the first reports of attacks by a giant crocodile on humans begin appearing in the area. The late 80s are the earliest traces of his modus operandi, where he killed people and dragged their bodies onto the bank, leaving them barely touched. By that time, Gustav was around his mid-40s already, so why did he start behaving like that so late? Through what we know today about crocodiles, there are several theories possible. Theory A, the herpetologist view. Gustav weighs over 2,000 pounds and measures close to 20 feet. Every movement burns significant calories that need to be replaced. We've seen that crocodiles never stop growing, but their energy needs don't scale linearly with size. A crocodile twice as long needs much more than twice the food because moving that mass requires exponentially more effort. For the first 3 decades of his life, Gustav could sustain himself the way any large crocodile does: fish, animals coming to drink, and the occasional competitor. By the late 1980s, he was in his mid-40s and had likely crossed the 18-foot mark. At that threshold, chasing fish starts costing more calories than it provides. His own body becomes a problem. Humans are slow, predictable, and show up at the same places along the water's edge. And remember, crocodiles have long-term memories. From a crocodile that can no longer afford fast pursuits, we are the perfect prey. Why were the bodies found uneaten then? The herpetologists would say that consuming large prey requires the death roll, where the crocodile spins its entire body to tear off chunks of flesh. At over 2,000 pounds, performing a death roll is exhausting. If Gustav isn't starving, processing a body might cost more than he would gain from eating it. So he kills, then either waits for decomposition to soften the flesh or moves on to another target. The late 1980s might simply be when his body crossed a threshold, forcing him to operate differently. Theory B, the trauma. As we've seen, Gustav's body carries scars inflicted by humans. A crocodile Gustav's size, carrying enough leather to change someone's life, probably became a target worth pursuing. As you know it, crocodiles have long-term associative memory. Studies have documented them remembering specific threats for over 40 years. Every time a human tried to kill Gustav, his brain stored information about the encounter until he eventually associated humans with danger. What they look like, what sounds precede the pain, etc. In the 1970s, firearms in Royal Burundi were relatively rare, but by the 1980s, political instability had pushed more weapons into circulation. Guns meant for militias ended up with poachers and villagers. Most of his scars were probably acquired during this period, which changed his behavior accordingly. At some point, Gustav may have stopped processing humans as potential food and began treating them as a recurring source of pain that needed to be eliminated whenever it appeared in his territory. The same response a dominant crocodile has toward a rival male. Theory C, the dark one, surplus killing. In most predators, killing and eating are linked together in a regulatory loop. Hunger triggers the hunt. A successful kill leads to feeding. Feeding creates satiation, and satiation suppresses the urge to kill until hunger returns. This loop evolved over millions of years to prevent wasted energy. In 1972, as we've seen, bodies floated down the Ruzizi for months, meaning he didn't need to hunt or even be hungry. During this period, his brain encoded a new association: human shape equals effortless food. Then the massacres ended, and for 13 to 15 years, the river returned to normal. Gustav had to go back to hunting fish and competing with hippos for space. The easy abundance was gone. But the pattern his brain learned didn't fade, but went dormant instead. When tensions rose again in the mid-1980s, more people started using the riverbanks. Refugees from early conflicts, villagers displaced by political instability, and whatnot. Gustav's brain had been wired for an abundance that no longer existed, and when humans started reappearing regularly, that old programming activated with disproportionate intensity. Instead of occasional opportunistic attacks, he shifted to systematic killing. Some researchers believe he may have been trying to recreate the conditions of 1972 by dragging bodies onto the bank, a stockpiling instinct triggered by the memory that abundance can disappear overnight. He kills and accumulates because his brain still operates on the assumption that the supply will vanish again. The frequency of his attacks starting from the late 1980s may reflect a predator whose regulatory mechanism was permanently altered by an experience that nature never prepared him for. These theories are convincing, but they all fail to answer two questions. 1. Why only him? Thousands of Nile crocodiles live in the Ruzizi. Hundreds of them are massive, have survived the same wars, and fed on the same bodies. 2. If this were just about biology or territory, why does Gustav seem to kill with a precision and a frequency that looks less like an animal's instinct and more like a choice? This is what we know about Gustav's career as a serial killer. The first confirmed attacks date back to the late 1980s, when he was around 40 years old. In 1993, the assassination of Burundi's president triggered a civil war that would eventually kill around 300,000 people. But to understand why the river turned red, you have to look at the neighbor. Burundi and Rwanda are often called false twins. They share the same geography and, crucially, the same ethnic divisions: the Hutus and the Tutsis. So when Rwanda imploded the following year, in 1994, the shockwave was immediate. Rwanda suffered a genocide that killed about 1 million people in 100 days, making it the deadliest genocide per unit of time ever recorded in human history. Because the two countries are so linked, this apocalypse poured gasoline on Burundi's own civil war. The violence spiraled out of control along the border, and the Ruzizi River became a dumping ground once again, carrying more human bodies than at any point in its history. Gustav was around 50. The attack reports from this period are difficult to verify because tracking crocodile attacks during a civil war is obviously not people's main focus, but the testimonies Faye collected suggest his activity increased significantly through the 1990s, leading to the 300 we mentioned. Coincidentally, his highest concentration of kills runs from 1993 to 2003. During the worst periods, rangers recorded 3 deaths in a single week within a few miles of each other. That is unheard of for a single crocodile. The total over 20 years sits somewhere between 60 confirmed victims and 300 suspected, but the exact number is impossible to verify in a region with thousands of other crocodiles. These two beaches, Magara and Manago, are where most of his attacks happened. Locals come here every day to fish or wash clothes. Gustav has learned these new patterns over the course of decades. He positioned himself in the deeper water just offshore and launched from below, where the murky water makes him invisible until it's too late. Normal crocodiles are quiet predators. They run from noise and agitation, which means they avoid attacking when multiple humans are present, but Gustav goes after groups. Most of his victims are fishermen or women washing laundry. The scars we mentioned earlier shaped how he operates today. The shoulder wound probably affected his surface swimming, which would explain why almost all documented attacks came from underwater. The repeated trauma from bullets and spears also created an aggressive reaction to boat engines. Most crocodiles flee when they hear a motor approaching. Gustav has learned to associate that sound with humans, and instead of fleeing, he does the opposite. Rangers have documented attacks on boats that got too close to Gustav's hiding spots in the delta. At his age, crocodiles usually have damaged teeth from decades of crunching through turtle shells, fish scales, and heavy mammal bones. Old crocodiles often end up nearly toothless. But we now know that Gustav's teeth are almost perfect. Human flesh is soft, with no shells to crack and no thick hide to tear through. Gustav's perfect dentition at 60 years old confirms a diet that has been predominantly human for decades. Back to the team in the 60 days deadline. They finished building a 30-foot steel cage that had taken over a year to design. Moving it into position required something closer to a military logistics operation than a standard wildlife capture. Over 30 men were needed to lift it, and they had to travel 4.3 miles from their village to the delta. They placed it at a bend in the river identified as Gustav's territory and baited it with fresh meat. An infrared camera was mounted inside the cage to detect any form of life in the dark. Suddenly, a bright white dot appears a few meters from the door. That's the eye of a crocodile that came checking the area. Despite its obvious curiosity, it did not enter the cage that night. When the team went to check the cage in the morning, it was just like when they left it. Empty, the meat untouched. A week passed since the cage had been installed, and despite every effort, the killer crocodile continued to haunt the Ruzizi while the meat rotted untouched inside the trap. The team's plan wasn't working and time was running out. The crocodile had been spotted on a high bank nearly a mile from the cage, so to increase their chances of capture without abandoning the cage, the team added more traps, perhaps better suited to that kind of terrain. 3 giant pitman traps, the largest in the world, measuring 16 feet tall and weighing nearly half a ton each. It took 2 exhausting days to install them along strategic riverbanks. Nothing escapes Gustav's eye. While the team was setting up the pitman traps, he was watching. With 2 weeks left before they had to leave Burundi, they now had a cage and 3 pitman traps, 4 traps in total, which should have quadrupled their chances of capturing the crocodile. 48 hours later, one of the pitman traps had sprung, but the crocodile inside was only a young crocodile. Even though the pitman traps seemed to be working better, the team did not abandon the cage. Since Gustav showed no interest in simple pieces of meat, they decided to try another kind of bait for the first time and put a live chicken inside, hoping it would move, make noise, and attract Gustav. The nights passed without any results. With only 1 week left, they decided to go all in with an even more appealing prey. They reluctantly placed a live goat inside the cage. Finally, a white spot appears, bigger than the others. This is Gustav's eye. Wary, the crocodile keeps his distance and disappears once again. Night after night, the same hope and the same disappointment. The infrared images, viewed over and over by the scientists, now left them uncertain. On the very last night, a massive storm hit the delta. When the team reached the cage the next morning, they found the cage partially submerged. The rain destroyed the infrared camera, and the goat was gone. Was it the water level that suddenly rose during that stormy night? Did Gustav enter without triggering the trap? Either way, we will never know what happened that night. The countdown was coming to an end. At the time, crocodiles were seen as simple predators driven by basic instincts, but science has moved on since then, and today we have answers that Faye and his team did not have at the time. A tied-up goat inside a cage is the easiest meal in the world, yet Gustav refused to touch it. We now know that crocodiles are far better at weighing risk against reward than anyone thought back then. When Gustav circled that cage night after night without striking, he was probably sensing that something was wrong. Today, we know that crocodiles have sensory organs along their jaws that can detect the heartbeat of nearby prey or the faint vibrations of a metal mechanism. His brain probably flagged the structure as a change in his environment that shouldn't be there. Large crocodiles can also remember specific events from their past. If Gustav had seen a trap or a snare decades earlier during the poaching years, he could recognize it. Modern science also discovered that crocodiles have individual personalities just like humans. Some are bold, others are cautious. But Gustav charges at crowds in broad daylight and becomes paranoid in front of a cage. A crocodile that rewrites its own rules depending on the situation is unheard of, which increases even more of the mystery around it. Most crocodiles follow a rigid program. If they're hungry and a prey shows up, they attack. If they're scared, they leave. Most crocodiles that become man-eaters end up caught or killed because they repeat the same predictable mistakes. Gustav has been the #1 target in Burundi for over 20 years, and no one has caught him. He is special. Charging at a crowd in broad daylight requires a total absence of fear, the confidence of a predator who knows he's untouchable. But switching from that to paranoid caution in front of a cage requires something else entirely. It requires the brain to stop reacting to what's in front of it, in that case the goat, and start evaluating everything around it, like the metal structure, the human scent, or the fact that none of this should be here. That kind of thinking is usually seen in orcas or chimpanzees, almost never in reptiles. But it is now clear that Gustav is not just any crocodile. He lived 60 years in a war zone with hundreds, if not thousands, of interactions with humans. Whether it is soldiers, poachers, or villagers, his scars testify that he learned the hard way humans are not one threat, but many. And sometimes, like with dogs or horses, an individual is simply more intelligent or a better observer than the rest of its species. The 60-day window closed, and the scientists had to leave. They failed, and yet again, Gustav won. For the next decade, he became a ghost. He was spotted in 2008, then again in 2015. This was the last time a credible source has seen him ever again. If he's still alive, he should be around 80 years old today. If he's dead, no one found the body. In the thick mud of the Ruzizi Delta, a carcass, even one weighing over 2,000 pounds, disappears quickly, reclaimed by the very ecosystem it dominated for over half a century. But in Burundi, people still look twice before approaching the water's edge at Magara or Manago, because as long as there is no proof of his death, the legend remains. Besides the bullets and spears, he survived the history of an entire region and became the living mirror of the violence that shaped him. Maybe he's gone, or maybe he's just doing what he's always done, waiting, perfectly still, just beneath the surface, for the next movement to trigger a reflex that never dies.